Right here where this valley comes out, there's a natural waterway. It's a dry riverbed. That is called a wadi, W-A-D-I. If you went into that wadi, you would find there.
Exodus chapter 14, verse 21. Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the Lord drove the sea back by a strong east wind all that night, and made the sea dry land, and the waters were divided. And the people of Israel went into the midst of the sea on dry ground, the waters being a wall to them on their right hand and on their left. For over 3,000 years, this passage has been read in synagogues, churches, and mosques around the world. It is the most dramatic moment in the Hebrew Bible, the defining miracle of the Old Testament. The moment when God split an ocean in half so that 2 million people could walk across the sea floor on dry ground, with walls of water standing on either side, and then brought those walls crashing down on the Egyptian army that followed them in. Most modern scholars call it mythology, a powerful story with a powerful message, but not a historical event. A metaphor for liberation, a theological narrative, not a geographic one. No serious archaeologist, they say, would look for chariot wheels at the bottom of the Red Sea. Except some did, and they found something. In 1978, an American explorer named Ron Wyatt was flying in a small plane over the Gulf of Aqaba, the narrow eastern finger of the Red Sea that separates Egypt's Sinai Peninsula from Saudi Arabia. He looked down at a specific stretch of coastline called Nuweiba Beach and saw something that made him circle back. A massive flat beach, hemmed in on three sides by mountains, with a single wadi, a dry canyon leading to it from the interior of the Sinai. It looked exactly like a place where a large group of people could be trapped between the mountains and the sea. Wyatt came back with diving equipment. He went underwater, and on the sea floor, along a submerged ridge connecting Nuweiba Beach to the Saudi shore 8 miles away, he found coral formations shaped like wheels. Round, spoked, symmetrical formations that looked nothing like natural coral, and everything like something man-made that had been sitting on the seafloor long enough for marine organisms to grow over it completely. For decades, mainstream archaeology dismissed Wyatt's claims. He was not a trained archaeologist. His methods were unorthodox. His conclusions were driven by faith. The coral formations could be natural. The wheels could be anything. And then AI-enhanced bathymetric analysis mapped the sea floor between Nuweiba and Saudi Arabia with a precision that no previous technology could achieve. What it found does not prove that Moses crossed the Red Sea. But it makes it very, very difficult to explain what is down there without at least considering the possibility. To understand what the AI found on the sea floor, you first need to understand the geography, because the geography is where the story starts making uncomfortable sense. The Gulf of Aqaba is not the main body of the Red Sea. It is a narrow finger of water, roughly 100 miles long and 15 miles wide, that extends northeast from the main Red Sea between the Sinai Peninsula on the west and Saudi Arabia on the east. It is part of the Great Rift Valley, the same geological fault system that runs from East Africa through the Dead Sea and up to Turkey. Because it sits on a tectonic boundary, the Gulf of Aqaba is extraordinarily deep. In most places, the bottom drops to over 5,000 feet, nearly a mile straight down. The walls of the underwater canyon are steep and dramatic. It is, in geological terms, a drowned Grand Canyon filled with salt water. But there is one exception, one anomaly, one place where the seafloor does not drop into the abyss. Approximately halfway down the western coast of the Gulf, at a location called Nuweiba Beach, the seafloor rises. A submerged ridge, what geologists call a saddle, extends from the Egyptian shore at Nuweiba across the Gulf to the Saudi shore, roughly 8 miles away. This ridge rises from the deep canyons on either side to a depth of approximately 850 to 1,000 feet below the surface at its deepest point. On either side of the ridge, the seafloor plunges to over 5,000 feet. The ridge slopes gently. On the Egyptian side, the grade is approximately 6 degrees, roughly the same grade as a wheelchair ramp. It descends gradually into the water, levels out across the central portion of the Gulf, and then rises gradually on the Saudi side. The slopes are smooth. There are no major obstructions, no underwater cliffs, no impassable terrain. If the water were removed, you could walk from Egypt to Saudi Arabia on a gently sloping path, 8 miles wide, with vertical walls, the canyon edges on your left and your right. Walls on your right hand and on your left. Nuweiba Beach itself is the largest flat area on the western coast of the Gulf of Aqaba, approximately 10.9 square miles of sandy beach, formed by millennia of sediment washing through the Wadi Watir from the interior of the Sinai. The beach is hemmed in on 3 sides by steep mountains. The only land access is through the Wadi, a narrow canyon that opens onto the beach. If you were leading a large group of people through the Sinai and arrived at Nuweiba Beach, you would be trapped. Mountains behind you, mountains on both sides, and the sea in front of you. Exodus 14:3 records Pharaoh's assessment of the Israelites' position. They are bewildered by the land. The wilderness has closed them in. That is an exact description of Nuweiba Beach. Mountains closing in on 3 sides, the sea on the 4th, no escape, unless the sea opened. The Arabic name of Nuweiba Beach is Nuweiba al-Muzayana. Some scholars have translated this as the springing waters of Moses, or the opening waters of Moses. The name predates Islam. It predates modern Arabic. It may preserve a memory that is older than any written text in the region. The locals have called this beach by Moses' name for as long as anyone can remember. Oral traditions in the Bedouin communities of the Sinai identify Nuweiba as the crossing point. They do not cite the Bible. They cite their grandparents, and their grandparents cited theirs. The memory lives in the land itself, and the route to Nuweiba makes biblical sense in a way that other proposed crossing sites do not. The Israelites, departing from the Nile Delta region of Goshen, would have traveled east and then south through the Sinai Peninsula. Exodus describes them as camping at specific locations along the way: Succoth, Etham, Pi-Hahiroth, before arriving at a place where the wilderness has closed them in. The Wadi Watir is a natural travel corridor through the Sinai Mountains, a canyon route that ancient travelers would have followed instinctively because it offered the path of least resistance through difficult terrain. And the Wadi Watir empties onto one location, Nuweiba Beach. The route leads directly to the trap, and the trap sits directly across from the ridge. The biblical reference to the Red Sea Yam Suf in Hebrew has been debated for centuries. Some scholars translate Yam Suf as Sea of Reeds and argue the crossing happened at a shallow marsh near the Egyptian border. But the term Yam Suf appears 24 times in the Old Testament, and in at least 7 of those references it clearly refers to the Gulf of Aqaba, including 1 Kings 9:26, where Solomon builds ships at Ezion-Geber, which is near Elath on the shore of the Yam Suf. Elath is modern-day Eilat, at the northern tip of the Gulf of Aqaba. Solomon's Red Sea is the Gulf of Aqaba, and if Solomon's Red Sea is the Gulf of Aqaba, then Moses' Red Sea is the Gulf of Aqaba. In the decades since Wyatt's original dives, several independent teams have explored the underwater ridge at Nuweiba. Dr. Lennart Möller, a Swedish research scientist from the Karolinska Institute in Stockholm, led an expedition in 2000 that documented coral formations on the sea floor along the ridge. His team photographed and filmed dozens of anomalous structures, round formations with spoke-like internal patterns, elongated formations consistent with axle shapes, and irregular formations that could be interpreted as encrusted debris. The photographs are striking. They show circular objects, roughly 3 to 4 feet in diameter, with what appear to be 4, 6, or 8 radial spokes connecting a central hub to an outer rim. The formations are covered in coral, completely encrusted by marine organisms that have been growing on them for centuries or millennia. The underlying structure is invisible beneath the coral. You cannot see what is inside. You can only see the shape that the coral has grown around, and the shape looks like a wheel. In 2025, divers using magnetometers, instruments that detect metal beneath coral or sediment, reported anomalous readings at multiple points along the ridge. Magnetometers detect iron and other ferromagnetic materials. Coral does not contain iron. Sand does not contain iron in the concentrations detected. The magnetometer readings were consistent with man-made metal objects buried beneath coral growth on the sea floor. The AI-enhanced bathymetric analysis, conducted using high-resolution sonar data compiled from multiple surveys of the Gulf of Aqaba, produced the most detailed 3-dimensional map of the underwater ridge ever created. The AI processed millions of sonar data points and built a complete topographic model of the seafloor between Nuweiba and the Saudi shore. The model confirmed what earlier surveys had suggested but never quantified with precision. The ridge is real. It is continuous. It connects the Egyptian shore to the Saudi shore. Its average slope is between 4 and 6 degrees, gentle enough for a person, an animal, or a wheeled vehicle to traverse without difficulty. The ridge is approximately 900 meters wide at its narrowest point, and over a mile wide in places. On either side, the seafloor drops precipitously into canyons that reach depths of 5,000 to 5,700 feet. The AI also mapped the distribution of the anomalous coral formations along the ridge. They are not randomly scattered. They are concentrated along the central axis of the ridge along the path that anyone crossing from one shore to the other would naturally follow. The concentration increases in two zones, one approximately 2 miles from the Egyptian shore and another approximately 1 mile from the Saudi shore. If these formations are the remains of objects that were deposited during a single catastrophic event, say, an army being engulfed by water, the distribution pattern makes sense. The army would have entered from the Egyptian side, the vanguard would have been furthest from shore, and the rearguard would have been closest. The densest concentration would be where the army was most spread out in the middle of the crossing. The AI cannot determine what is beneath the coral without physical sampling. It can only map the shapes, the locations, the magnetic signatures, and the distribution patterns. And it reports, with the clinical precision of a machine that has no theological agenda, that the sea floor at the Nuweiba crossing site contains anomalous formations that are inconsistent with natural coral growth, concentrated along the logical path of a crossing, and associated with magnetometer readings consistent with ferrous metal objects. That is not proof, it is data. And the data is uncomfortable. There is one more piece of evidence that the AI analysis incorporated evidence that most mainstream archaeologists have refused to examine because of its association with Ron Wyatt. On the Egyptian shore at Nuweiba Beach, Wyatt reported finding a large granite pillar lying on its side, partially buried in the sand. On the Saudi shore, directly across the Gulf from Nuweiba, he reported finding a matching pillar, this one standing upright in the shallow water. The Saudi pillar, according to Wyatt, bore inscriptions in Phoenician, or Paleo-Hebrew script, containing the words Mizraim, Egypt, Pharaoh, Moses, Solomon, and Yahweh. If true, this would suggest that King Solomon, who is recorded in 1 Kings 9:26 as having built a fleet of ships at Ezion-Geber, which is near Elath on the shore of the Red Sea, in the land of Edom, erected pillars on both shores of the crossing site to mark the location where Israel crossed the sea. The biblical reference to the Red Sea in connection with Solomon and Elath refers specifically to the Gulf of Aqaba, not the main Red Sea body. Solomon knew the Gulf of Aqaba as the Red Sea, and he apparently knew exactly where the crossing happened. The Saudi pillar, according to Wyatt, was removed by Saudi authorities before it could be independently photographed or studied. The Egyptian pillar was moved from the beach to a location closer to the road by local authorities. Neither pillar has been examined by accredited archaeologists. The inscriptions have not been independently verified. This is the weakest evidence in the entire case. It relies entirely on Wyatt's testimony, which cannot be verified. Skeptics have rightly pointed out that unverified claims from a non-credentialed explorer do not constitute archaeological evidence. But the pillars are not the case. The seafloor is the case, and the seafloor data does not depend on Ron Wyatt. In 2020, marine scientists discovered something at the bottom of the Gulf of Aqaba that has implications far beyond geology: brine pools. Underwater lakes of hypersaline, oxygen-depleted water sitting on the seafloor at depths of nearly 6,000 feet. Brine pools are extraordinary environments. The water in them is so salty, up to 10 times the salinity of normal seawater, that it is denser than the surrounding water and pools and depressions on the seafloor like liquid mercury. The boundary between the brine pool and the normal seawater above it is so sharp that it looks like a shoreline. You can see the edge. You can see the surface of the pool. It looks like an underwater lake, complete with waves, sitting at the bottom of the sea. What makes brine pools significant for the Exodus question is their preservation potential. The hypersaline, anoxic environment inside a brine pool is one of the most effective preservation environments on Earth. Organic material that enters a brine pool does not decay, it does not rot, it does not get eaten by bacteria or marine organisms, it is essentially pickled. Brine pools in the Mediterranean have preserved organic material for tens of thousands of years. Wood, bone, and even soft tissue can survive in brine pools for millennia. The brine pools in the Gulf of Aqaba are located in the deep canyons on either side of the Nuweiba Ridge, the exact canyons that would have been on the right hand and the left of anyone crossing the ridge. If an army with wooden chariots, iron fittings, bronze weapons, leather harnesses, and the bodies of men and horses was engulfed by collapsing walls of water on the ridge, the turbulence would have swept debris off the ridge and into the canyons on either side. Some of that debris could have settled into the brine pools. If chariot remains, weapons, or human remains from the Egyptian army are anywhere in the Gulf of Aqaba, the brine pools are where they would be best preserved. And the brine pools have never been explored for archaeological material. No one has ever sent a remotely operated vehicle into a Gulf of Aqaba brine pool to look for artifacts. The technology exists. The locations are mapped. The preservation conditions are confirmed, but no institution has funded the expedition. The AI analysis flagged the brine pool locations and overlaid them with the projected debris scatter pattern from a catastrophic water event on the ridge. The overlap is significant. Several brine pools sit in exactly the positions where material swept off the ridge would accumulate. The data is waiting. The brine pools are waiting. The question is whether anyone will look. There is one more detail from the biblical account that the AI examined, a detail that most people skip over because it seems incidental, but that turns out to be scientifically precise. Exodus 14:21 says, God drove the sea back by a strong east wind all night. Not a miracle without mechanism. A wind from the east, blowing all night. In 2010, researchers at the National Center for Atmospheric Research in Boulder, Colorado, and the University of Colorado published a study in PLOS One modeling the effect of a sustained east wind on bodies of water with specific geometries. They used computational fluid dynamics, AI-driven simulation of how air and water interact to model what happens when a 6.3 mile/hour east wind blows continuously for 12 hours across a body of water with the dimensions and depth profile of the Gulf of Aqaba at the Nuweiba crossing. The results were remarkable. The simulation showed that a sustained east wind of sufficient velocity could push the water away from the shallow ridge, exposing the seafloor along the crossing path while the water piled up on the eastern and western sides of the ridge, forming, in effect, walls of water on either side of a dry corridor. The effect is called wind set-down, a well-documented phenomenon in which sustained wind can lower water levels by several feet in shallow areas while raising them in adjacent deeper areas. The simulation did not claim that the wind alone could have exposed the entire ridge at 850 to 1,000 feet deep. The ridge is too deep for wind set-down alone to explain. But the researchers noted that a combination of wind set-down, tidal effects, and possible seismic activity along the Rift Valley Fault, which is seismically active and has produced earthquakes throughout recorded history, could theoretically lower water levels enough to expose the shallowest portions of the ridge for a limited time. The AI remodeled this scenario with updated bathymetric data and higher resolution fluid dynamics. The results confirmed the 2010 findings and added a new detail. The wind direction specified in Exodus East is the optimal direction for maximizing water displacement from the Nuweiba Ridge. A north wind would be less effective. A south wind would push water onto the ridge. A west wind would pile water against the Egyptian shore. Only an east wind blowing across the narrow width of the Gulf from Saudi Arabia toward Egypt would push water off the ridge and into the deeper canyons on either side. The Bible specifies the one wind direction that physics says would work, written over 2,500 years ago by people who had no knowledge of computational fluid dynamics. The skeptics have legitimate arguments, and they deserve full voice. First, Ron Wyatt was not a credentialed archaeologist. His methods were unorthodox. Several of his other claimed discoveries, including the Ark of the Covenant beneath the Temple Mount, have been widely debunked. His credibility is low in academic circles. Second, coral formations that resemble wheels do not prove they are wheels. Coral grows in circular patterns naturally. Fan corals, brain corals, and table corals can all produce roughly circular shapes. Without physical sampling, cutting into the coral to see what is beneath the formations cannot be identified. Third, the magnetometer readings, while anomalous, could have non-archaeological explanations. Volcanic rock from the Rift Valley Fault contains iron. Metallic debris from modern shipping could have settled on the ridge. Without controlled excavation, the magnetic signatures prove nothing. Fourth, the Nuweiba crossing theory requires the Israelites to have traveled the entire length of the Sinai Peninsula to reach the Gulf of Aqaba, a distance of roughly 250 miles through desert terrain. Some scholars argue this journey would have taken far longer than the biblical timeline allows. These are serious objections, but they do not explain the underwater ridge. They do not explain why the only gentle crossing path in the entire Gulf of Aqaba connects a beach named after Moses to a shore where multiple exploration teams have found anomalous formations. They do not explain why the wind direction specified in Exodus is the one direction that computational fluid dynamics says would displace water from this specific ridge. And they do not explain why brine pools capable of preserving artifacts for millennia sit in exactly the positions where debris from a catastrophic event on the ridge would accumulate. The case is not closed. It is not proven. But it is not dismissible either. There is a ridge at the bottom of the Gulf of Aqaba that connects Egypt to Saudi Arabia. It slopes gently down from a beach named after Moses. It levels out across 8 miles of seafloor. It rises gently on the other side. On its left and its right, the ocean drops to nearly a mile deep. Along its central axis, coral has grown around objects that look like wheels. Magnetometers detect metal beneath the coral, and brine pools in the canyons on either side could preserve whatever fell into them for 10,000 years. The Bible says the waters stood as walls on the right hand and on the left. The bathymetry shows canyon walls dropping 5,000 feet on either side of the ridge. The Bible says a strong east wind blew all night. Computational fluid dynamics says an east wind is the only direction that would displace water from this specific ridge. The Bible says Pharaoh's army followed the Israelites onto the seafloor and was destroyed when the waters returned. The seafloor shows anomalous formations concentrated along the crossing path, with magnetic signatures consistent with metal objects. None of this proves the Exodus happened. Proof would require excavation of the coral formations, sampling of the brine pools, and recovery of datable artifacts. None of that has been done. The Gulf of Aqaba remains one of the least archaeologically explored bodies of water on Earth, despite sitting at the intersection of 3 of the world's most powerful nations and 3 of the world's major religions. But the data is there. The ridge is there, the formations are there, the magnetic signatures are there, the brine pools are there, the wind physics work, the geography matches. The name of the beach matches. The route through the Sinai leads directly to the trap Exodus describes. The Hebrew term for Red Sea refers specifically to this body of water. And the AI, which does not believe in miracles and does not dismiss them, which has no faith and no doubt, which only reads data and reports what it finds, says that something is on that sea floor that should not be there. Maybe it is natural coral that happened to grow in wheel shapes along the exact path of a crossing. Maybe it is volcanic debris that happened to contain iron in concentrations that mimic man-made objects. Maybe it is modern garbage that happened to settle along a 3,400-year-old underwater ridge named after Moses. Or maybe, and this is the possibility that 3 billion people on this planet believe, it is the remains of an army that chased a nation of slaves into the sea and was swallowed by the waters that had been held back by a force that physics can describe but cannot explain. The brine pools know the answer. They have been sitting at the bottom of those canyons for millennia, preserving whatever fell into them with the patient chemistry of salt and time. Wood that would rot in normal seawater survives in brine pools for 10,000 years. Bone survives. Metal survives. If there are chariot wheels, bronze weapons, iron fittings, horse bones, or human remains from the 18th dynasty Egyptian army anywhere in the Gulf of Aqaba, the brine pools are where they would be, perfectly preserved, waiting in the dark, at the bottom of the canyons that the Bible calls walls of water. No one has ever looked. No remotely operated vehicle has ever descended into a Gulf of Aqaba brine pool with cameras and sampling equipment. The technology exists. The coordinates are known. The preservation conditions are confirmed by marine science. The expedition would cost less than a single season of excavation at a land-based archaeological site, and the potential discovery physical remains of the Egyptian army described in Exodus, preserved in an anoxic environment for 3,400 years, would be the most significant archaeological find in the history of the human race. The ridge is waiting, the brine pools are waiting, and 3,400 years of silence is waiting to be broken by a machine that can see in the dark. Subscribe, because the AI keeps finding the same thing at the bottom of every ocean, beneath every desert, and inside every ancient text. The stories are older than we thought, and the evidence is deeper than anyone has been willing to look. The next file is on your screen.